I'm John Heilemann, and this is the Hell and High Water Podcast. My guest is former Assistant Director of the FBI, Frank Figliuzzi.
I'm Frank Figliuzzi, and the state of our union is in peril. And it's in peril because we are divided, polarized, and most of all, we're divided and polarized when it comes to saving our own lives in a global, deadly pandemic. If a culture and society can't agree on how to save their asses, then they're in peril.
We're going back to the Capitol, right where it started, on September 18th. And we're going to push back against the phony narrative that there was an insurrection. We're going to provide the kind of evidence that Nancy Pelosi won't allow to be presented at her select committee, showing that this was a largely peaceful crowd, showing that this was a crowd that was egged on in many ways by Capitol Police throwing flashbang grenades into a relatively peaceful crowd. We're going to continue to raise the volume and push back against this phony narrative and demand justice for these political prisoners.
So that's Matthew Brainerd, a former supposed Trump campaign official who I've never heard of until this moment. A guy who was not, he was on Steve Bannon's now increasingly and insidiously popular War Room Pandemic or War Room, whatever the fuck it is called now, podcast. He's been going on there quite frequently of late, drumming up interest in this event that's taking place on September 18th. And we're here with Frank Figliuzzi.
Thanks for having me. Wish we were talking about a happier topic, but here we are.
We never talk about happy topics, Frank. That's our whole relationship is based on unhappy topics, essentially. So what do you make of this thing? That was Brainerd a couple months ago when he announced that this thing was happening, this rally. He's been on Bannon and other places since then, trying to basically say, hey, it's going to be a peaceful protest, don't worry. But there's obviously been a lot of concern among a lot of people in Washington, among law enforcement people, among intelligence people, that this could be a very bad scene. What's your current take on how much we have to fear?
So I want to talk about it at a very kind of micro level on what the 18th of September might look like around the country. But I really want to talk about this September 18th rally as a symptom of a much larger problem in the body democracy, right? So, rallies come and go. The rally could end up being well secured and fizzle out or be peaceful. But the fact that they're holding the rally, the fact that the clip you just played reflects a sentiment that people are aggrieved, that Ashley Babbitt is a martyr, that the people being arrested and held for January 6th violence are somehow political hostages and prisoners. That's the topic of discussion. That's what puts us in peril. Let's talk first about the micro thing, about the security of the day. So if you had asked me this question a couple of weeks ago about, hey, is there going to be violence on September 18th? I would have said this. I'm concerned about localized violence around the country. I think DC is going to be heavily secured. I know it is. The police, the intel community, they're all coming together on this one. Maybe the fence will go up. Maybe it'll be around the perimeter. Maybe it'll be around the building of the Capitol. But I think it's going to be, with some scattered possibilities of fights and things breaking out on the periphery. I think it's going to be secure. That's what I would have said 2 weeks ago. Now, here's what's changed with regard to monitoring the chatter on violent extremist sites, and in particular, the Proud Boys. What's changed is they are now incensed about Biden's vaccine mandates. They think the sky is falling now, and they are indeed talking about violence. Now, it doesn't change the fact that DC is going to be really secure, but what I see them talking about is they use this phrase, going local. So yes, I think now incensed, they're going to show up in DC, but also, state and local authorities better be ready. And DHS has told them this, because I think they are also going to go local.
But this vaccine mandate thing really seems to have changed the calculus and changed the emotional pitch and the dynamics in a way that again, you monitor this traffic. I don't, but it just from my distance, I'm like, I'm starting to get a little nervous myself. It's got
them totally riled up, even talking about recently, just in the last few days, Proud Boys in their private chat rooms talking about how to build homemade incendiary devices. They believe this is kind of an authoritarian Nazi regime. They point out that Biden did reportedly tweak his federal employee mandate and federal contractor mandate where he could control the environment, which is to go from vaccine or tests weekly for federal employees to vaccines, period. And they're focused on that. But here's the other component of this. Now the resistance to that has been mainstreamed. So it wasn't, I wish it were just these fringe and violent extremist groups, but they are being led and incited by now elected officials going on television saying, resist, don't do it, we're suing. And that is radicalization. And I get in trouble every time I say it, and I no longer care because it's true. Yeah. My days in the FBI working international terrorism are now eerily similar to what I'm seeing in form of online radicalization of our own people.
Right. What does that mean? Say more about that. What are the parallels that you can draw between those two experiences as we sit here literally just a couple days after the 9/11 anniversary, the 20th anniversary of 9/11?
Yeah, you have to have some form of leadership in radicalization. And we saw it getting faster and faster with Al-Qaeda and then ISIS, where young people, particularly a 19-year-old guy sitting at home in Minneapolis or Columbus, Ohio, watching beheading videos, listening to a radical cleric talk about, killing the infidels. We were down to, say, 9 weeks of watching videos from no radicalization to I'm ready, sign me up, I'm ready to travel to go kill some infidels. 9 weeks. The power of social media and online radicalization. That's a parallel I see now happening with the mentorship and in inciting by people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and you name them, Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, everybody saying, let's resist, let's not do the mandate, this is the end of the world. That's their leadership. And that's where they seek affirmation and get incited to violence.
There are planned events now for the Justice for J6 world going on in state capitals for subsequent weeks. This is a thing that could be a multi-day, not just a single day threat, but a multi-location, multi-week, multi-month, who knows, rolling threat that we have to deal with in the context of a very heated political moment that you've been referring to. And I think that also multiplies the concern, because it's not even just we just need to focus on one day in one city here. We have to focus on a lot of places and a lot of days.
I'm glad you mentioned this because I want to point something out that's not getting enough coverage. Having now been in media, so to speak, as a talking head for almost approaching 4 years, I guess, right. I've really seen the dilemma on what to cover, how much to cover, whether you're giving voice to people who don't need any coverage. But here's the thing that I think I know it's not getting covered. On any given weekend, John, right now, for the past few months, there are Proud Boys assemblies in cities near you, namely Pacific Northwest, but everywhere, where shots are fired. There are clashes with counter protesters. This is now a weekend outing every weekend, and it's happening. It's already happened this weekend. And yes, the Olympia, Washington is going to happen sometime in September, and has been happening. Right. A Proud Boy leader or longtime member named Tiny Toez was shot last weekend or weekend before. Nobody's realizing, except for folks who live in these poor places where they can't go downtown on a weekend, that it's already happening. So yes, you're right. And DHS has been warning state, county, local police departments, get your act together, because this is going to continue to happen and perhaps really explode on or about the 18th or thereafter. Instead of Oath Keepers or Three Percenters or Proud Boys, let's say they were affiliates of Al-Qaeda or ISIS, January 6th would never have happened.
Unfortunately, as you noted, Mr. Chairman, January 6th was not an isolated event. The problem of domestic terrorism has been metastasizing across the country for a long time now, and it's not going away anytime soon. Back in June of 2019, under my leadership, we elevated racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism to our highest threat priority, on the same level with ISIS and homegrown violent extremists. And racially motivated violent extremism is the biggest chunk of our domestic terrorism portfolio, if you will, overall. I will also say that the same group of people we're talking about have been responsible for the most lethal attacks over the last, say, decade.
So that's Chris Wray. And that's not the first time he said it. It won't be the last. But he's been very forthright, Frank, about the notion that this is the difference between the era of 9/11. That the real threat we face is domestic, and the particular form of domestic terrorism that we are most concerned about is not just anti-government terrorism, but is racially motivated, white nationalist extremism. Has his leadership in terms of action met the clarity and forcefulness of his words on this question in your judgment?
I think his leadership post January 6 has been, as far as I can tell, on the mark, and I'll explain why in a second. I think, however, his leadership prior to January 6 has been lacking, but that's complicated stuff. It has to do with who he may be, but even more importantly, it has to do with the fact that we still, John, don't have a domestic terrorism law. It's not against the law to commit acts of domestic terrorism. It's against some other laws, assault, trespass, right? But we don't have a law against domestic terrorism, and we don't therefore have the tools. We can't designate domestic terrorism organizations like we do in international terrorism. We can't get out in front of it. If you changed the religion of the people breaching the Capitol on January 6th to Islam, and instead of Oath Keepers or Three Percenters or Proud Boys, let's say they were affiliates of Al-Qaeda or ISIS, January 6th would never have happened.
I've never really had a conversation about your background and your history. And so I'd love for you to just talk about it. How did you get, was that like, I want to be at the FBI and you did these educational things that eventually set you up for that career? Or did you stumble into the FBI?
Yeah, yes, I always did. I mean, at age 11, I wrote a letter to the head of the FBI in Connecticut where I grew up. And I said, as an 11-year-old kid, hey, I want to be an FBI agent. And he writes a letter back and says, and God bless him that he did that. And for that reason, I'll always take time to talk to young people myself about the FBI. But he writes back and he goes, hey, get back to us, when you're of age. Here's what you got to do, blah, blah, blah. Here are the qualifications. And yes, I went to law school because being a lawyer was going to be a fallback for me. I went to law school because at that time, it was lawyers and accountants that the FBI needed and wanted. And I thought I would be good at the law school thing. And yeah, and it happened. It's like a kid wanting to be a firefighter or center fielder for the New York Yankees. And somehow, miraculously, it happened. Yeah.
So you've seen a lot of directors come and go. Tell me about that. I would love to just get your kind of 30,000 foot panoramic assessment of those leaders and who you admired the most, who you thought, now that you're out of it, you could probably say who you thought was most wanting. Who's the gold standard and who's the tin standard, so to speak, of the directors you served under?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts there. First, let's remind your listeners that the FBI director has a 10-year term. That's really, really important. Why is that important? It's designed to ensure that an FBI director remains apolitical, straddles administrations, and is not supposed to serve at the whim of a president. So I can't emphasize enough that when people ask me, should Chris Wray get fired? Should blah, 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 blah. The first thing I say is, as an institutionalist, be careful. Be careful. If you start firing, as Jim Comey has learned from Trump, if you start firing FBI directors because you don't like what they're investigating or not pledging loyalty to you, we're going to end up with a highly politicized federal law enforcement agency. Every director has left his own mark. I say his because we haven't had a female director yet. And so, for example, I'll give you examples. Louis Freeh, what was the hallmark of his term? He took the FBI abroad. He opened FBI offices everywhere. Today, most people are amazed to learn the FBI has over 60 offices overseas. All crime, of course, is global now. So they're called legal attachés. It doesn't say FBI agent on their business card over there. They're inside U.S. embassies. and it's all about intelligence, liaison, etc. Okay, so that's kind of Freeh's mark. William Webster was known for bulking up the laboratory and science. That's what he left on the organization. Mueller, of course, the guy came into that position, and within 2 weeks, 9/11 happened. Imagine being the head of the FBI, not even really knowing where the men's room is, and and they go, "Sir, we're under attack by terrorists," right? And you're in charge. Unbelievable. And what was his legacy? Without a doubt, he got us into a counterterrorism mode that ultimately kept us from getting attacked again. And he's got to be credited with that. And that was amid calls to disband the FBI. I was there when Congress was saying the FBI failed on 9/11. We got to break it up. We need it. We need an intelligence. We heard it again, John, on January 6th. We got to have a domestic spy agency, and then we have to have a separate law enforcement agency. And when I hear people say that, I say, go have a beer with the Canadians or the Brits and ask them about MI5 and the fact that they have no arrest powers, or ask the Canadians at RCMP if they have any intelligence capabilities and if it's broken. And they'll tell you after 2 or 3 beers, we wish we had what the FBI had.
A lot of FBI directors have been controversial. I remember when Louis Freeh was very controversial also. But Comey's kind of transcended that in the controversy department. And even, he still has enormously fierce, loyal defenders and incredibly intense critics. I wonder whether which of those count. I know we've discussed this in the past, but I feel like you have a more nuanced view.
Yeah, well, I write a little bit about this in my book, which is primarily a book about values-based leadership. And Comey really is someone you have to talk about if you talk about values-based leadership, but you also have to talk to him about kind of a tragic flaw that he has, which is, I believe sometimes he is so righteous. And by the way, he is a man of the highest integrity, but sometimes I believe that translates into thinking that he's the only one in the room who can make the most ethical, righteous decision. And with regard to that now infamous press conference with the flags draped behind him at FBI headquarters announcing that, quote, no reasonable prosecutor would ever bring charges against Hillary Clinton. In that moment, most of us started texting each other saying, oh my God, he may not realize it, but he just politicized the FBI. It's not the FBI's job to make prosecutive decisions. It's DOJ's job. They're across the street on Pennsylvania Avenue. He took it all on himself, whether it was because he didn't trust Loretta Lynch, the AG at the time, whether he wanted to take that off her shoulders, whether he thought he would bring credibility to the decision. In that one fell swoop, he did so much damage to the perception and credibility of the Bureau that I have to look at him as a flawed character. We're divided. We can't save ourselves from a pandemic. This is where we're going. And I believe, sadly, that we may have a kind of permanent insurgency developing within our society.
Well, I was astonished, frankly, by his statements. Number one, there's no basis in law for it. And number two, as you point out, it is a felony to obstruct a congressional investigation. But the real point is, what's he hiding? Why is he trying to keep the truth from coming out? I think the leaders of our country, and Kevin is one of them, should be stepping forward and trying to get to the bottom of everything that led up to January 6th. And people who aren't doing that are a mystery to me, unless they participated. I don't know.
The 1-6 Select Committee under the leadership of Benny Thompson, with a couple Republicans on there who people don't, in the Republican Party, don't think of as Republicans anymore, Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney. They're doing their work. They've had a hearing. They're working somewhat to some extent in public and some extent in private. One of the things they did was they went to telecom companies and to social media companies and said, we have a bunch of information we want about 1-6. So please preserve those records for us. And Kevin McCarthy and the Republican Party, particularly in the House, flipped the fuck out and started threatening those companies and said, do not comply. Just like, do not comply with the vaccine mandates. Do not comply with these requests from the Select Committee, we want to get to the bottom of this, but you guys should not comply. That's the position of Kevin McCarthy. That drew this response from Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren on MSNBC not long ago. Is it a mystery to you, Frank?
It's not much of a mystery to me. People who are protesting too much are often people who don't want truth to come out. One of the things that I look at in terms of judging threat and craziness is the degree to which people are willing to undermine their own authority. So we now have members of Congress who you would think would want to preserve for the future, for future Congresses, even for themselves someday, if their party comes back in power, the ability to conduct an inquiry and subpoena and collect records. And they've decided that no, for this moment in time, we really don't want anybody complying with a congressional request. Now, in a heartbeat, if they take power, they'll open inquiries and demand people comply with their request.
So give me your sense of how you think the committee is doing so far. I think that this is the most important work Congress is doing, and I think Congress is doing a lot of important work on the economy, on healthcare, even on voting rights. I think this is more important than all of it because the reality is, I know it's now going to be portrayed as a partisan outcome. I know I'm not a fantasist. I'm not naive about this, right? But I do think it's super important. There is truth, and there is reality, and there is a way to get, if this committee proceeds in the proper way with the due aggressiveness, where we can learn a lot, if not everything, a lot about what happened on January 6th. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious where you are on how well Benny Thompson and his team is doing, mm-hmm. and whether there's any area where you'd like them to do something different or more.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay. So first, the painfully slow part is the negative part of this. I think they lost momentum by taking the break after the very compelling officer testimony. They lost, the nation was kind of really paying attention, and they lost that. And then, but I'm gonna come back with, it's a human nature thing to say, this is urgent. Where's the sense of urgency? Keep moving. But then there's some evidence to show that, okay, maybe there's a method to this slowness. I also get concerned that we're losing the concept of three equal branches of government. And by that, I mean, we had 4 years under Trump of people thumbing their nose at congressional subpoenas and requests to testify. And that's a horrible thing. I recognize that much of the American public won't pay any attention, but if you get those phone records and you expose those conversations and the timing, and you get people saying, I refuse to show up and talk to you under threat of penalty of law, then I think people are going to see them for what they are. I would love to see a sergeant at arms visit McCarthy's house and drag him in to testify. We'll see what happens.
Watching those officers testify, tell their stories, grippingly, compellingly, authentically, sincerely, I felt grateful to them for their service. And then to see Fox News, to see Lori Ingraham and others get on television, not just dismiss them, but to call them crisis actors.
The theatrics were intended to produce an emotional reaction. Logic and facts be damned. God save us from these third-rate theatrics.
I thought it was one of the most morally depraved things I've seen in media, really ever in my career. And it gets to the depth of the problem we have, Frank, right? Which is, that this division in the country and the depth of it and the alternate realities that people live in and the misinformation, the disinformation, and Donald Trump and what's happened to the Republican Party, as you look down the runway, in terms of thinking about the kinds of threat, the intensity of the threat, and the range of the threat, what do you see over the course of the next, not just weeks, but months and years, to try to deal with this extremism threat, this white nationalist threat, this domestic terror threat? How does that all play out in your mind?
Yeah, I have to tell you, and at the risk of sounding really dour, I don't look at the future with encouragement. I am very concerned that the division we're experiencing now has become entrenched, mostly because of media. And I include, in a big way, social media on this. It is radicalization on steroids, division and disinformation. Throw in foreign adversaries who've now figured us out and figured out the use of social media, the Russians and others now who are going to go, wow, we can absolutely impact how Americans think about everything, even a deadly pandemic, even vaccines. And this is our future. We are watching the future right now, and it doesn't bode well for law enforcement and intelligence work. It's a new world we're living in. We're divided. We can't save ourselves from a pandemic. This is where we're going, and I believe, sadly, that we may have a kind of permanent insurgency developing within our society.
Thanks for taking the time today to be on Hell and High Water. That's our show. Have a great day.